There is a particular kind of wound that no stranger can ever give you. It doesn't come from an enemy or a thief or a liar you meet out in the world. It comes from the two people who loved you before you ever took your first breath. The two people who were supposed to stand between you and everything cruel in this life. My name is Ethan, and for 38 years I believed, without a single shadow of doubt, that my mother and father would choose me over anyone, over anything. I believed that the way you believe the sun will rise, or that the floor will hold when you step out of bed in the morning. I never questioned it, not once. And that unquestioning faith is exactly what made what happened to me so slow, so quiet, and so completely impossible to see coming. I want you to picture a dinner table, a long wooden table my father built with his own hands in the garage the year I turned 10, the same table I did my homework on, the same table where we said grace every Sunday for as long as I can remember. On the last night I was ever welcome in that house, there were 5 plates set on it, one for my mother, Diane, one for my father, Ray, one for my younger sister, Emily, one that should have been mine, and one for the woman who spent 2 years quietly, patiently, and deliberately taking my place in my own family, the woman I used to love, my ex. Her name was Sabrina, and by the time I understood what she was really doing under my parents' roof, there was no chair left at that table with my name on it. People hear a story like mine and they assume it must be simple. They assume there was a screaming match, a betrayal, some single terrible night that split a family down the middle. But that is not how you lose the people who raised you. You don't lose them all at once. You lose them the way a shoreline loses sand, one grain at a time, so slowly that you swear nothing has changed, right up until the day you look down and realize the ground you were standing on is gone. That is how I lost my parents. Not in a fight, not in a single afternoon. I lost them across 2 years of phone calls that went unanswered, of holidays I stopped being invited to, of decisions made in rooms I was no longer allowed to enter. And the strangest part, the part that kept me awake for months, was that I could not understand why. Because you have to understand who Sabrina was to us before any of this began. When I brought her home, my parents didn't just like her, they adored her. My mother, who had waited years for a daughter-in-law, treated Sabrina like the child she'd always dreamed of. They cooked together, they shopped together. My father, a hard, proud, old-fashioned man who never warmed to anyone quickly, softened around her in a way I had never once seen him soften around me. 6 years we were together. 6 years she sat at that table every Sunday, learned my mother's recipes, laughed at my father's same old stories, wrapped herself so completely into the fabric of my family that by the end, people forgot she wasn't born into it. And I was proud of that. I thought I had given my parents someone to love. I had no idea I was handing them the very thing that would tear us apart. When the relationship finally ended, and I will tell you exactly how and why it ended later in this story, I did what my father raised me to do. I kept it quiet. There is a rule in my family, one my dad repeated my entire childhood. We handle our problems inside this house, and nobody outside ever needs to know. So I never told my parents the ugly details. I never dragged Sabrina's name through the mud. I ended things with as much dignity as I could hold on to, and I assumed, the way any son would assume, that my family would close ranks around me, that they would grieve the relationship for a week or two, and then quietly let her go, the way families do. That is not what happened, not even close. And the choice they made instead is the reason I am telling you this today. Because after the breakup, Sabrina did not leave. She stayed. She stayed in the group chats. She stayed at Sunday dinner. She stayed in my mother's kitchen and my father's good graces. And when I asked why, I was told to be understanding. I was told she'd had a hard time. I was told, in 100 small ways, that I was the one being difficult by expecting my own parents to stand with me. At first I told myself it was pity. Give it a month, I thought, and it will pass. It did not pass. It grew. Every month it grew a little stronger and a little colder, until the woman I used to date was sitting in my chair, and I was the one standing outside the door of the house I grew up in, wondering how in God's name I had become the outsider in my own family. And it was not just holidays. It was not just hurt feelings. Because slowly, piece by piece, I began to notice things that did not add up. Money that moved in directions it never should have. My father, a man who counted every dollar twice, quietly handing sums to a woman who was no longer even part of our family. A place for her, out of nowhere, inside the business my grandfather started and my father spent 40 years building. The business that was supposed to one day be mine. And then the thing I still struggle to say out loud, even now, the paperwork, the will, the discovery that my parents had quietly written a woman I broke up with into our family's future, and in the same stroke of a pen, had begun to write me out of it. So I need you to sit with the questions I had to sit with, because they are the questions that drove me to the truth. The first question is the one that seems obvious, but never had an obvious answer. Why would two loving parents turn against their own son to protect his ex-girlfriend? The second question is quieter, and it is the one that started to frighten me. What did Sabrina have? What did she hold that I did not? And the third question is the one that changed everything, the one I did not even know to ask until it was almost too late. What was she really after all along? And what, exactly, was she hiding? Because people do not rewrite their wills and sacrifice their own children out of affection. They do it out of something else. They do it out of fear. Before we go any deeper, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Trust me when I tell you that you are going to want to see how this one ends, because nothing about it is what it appears to be on the surface. And the truth, when I finally found it, was not a truth I was ready to carry. Here is the one thing I need you to hold on to, all the way through, no matter how bad it looks, and it is going to look very bad. My parents did not choose Sabrina over me. I know that is exactly what it seemed like, from the outside and from the inside both. I lived 2 years of my life absolutely certain that my mother and father had simply decided they loved her more than they loved their own son. But that is not what happened. That is not what happened at all. It took me 2 long years, one estranged uncle who was too afraid to speak, a locked drawer in my father's office, and a single sealed envelope to finally understand what really did. And by the time I understood it, the chance to fix any of it was already gone. So to make sense of how a stranger walked into my family and quietly took my place at that table, we have to go back, all the way back, to the family I thought I knew. I grew up in a modest 2-story house on a street where everybody knew everybody, in a town where a man's name meant something and a handshake still counted as a contract. My father, Ray, was a builder. He ran the family contracting business that his own father had started with nothing but a truck, a ladder, and a reputation for never cutting a corner. From the time I could walk, I was on those job sites. I learned to swing a hammer before I learned to ride a bike, and I learned, more than anything, that in our family, loyalty was not a word you said. It was a thing you did, quietly, every single day, without ever asking for credit. My mother, Diane, was the heart of the house. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, who cooked for the whole neighborhood when someone was sick, who could make a stranger feel like family within an hour of meeting them. And my little sister, Emily, 4 years younger than me, was the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over every argument before it could grow. We were not a rich family. We were not a perfect family. But we were, or at least I believed we were, an unbreakable one. If you had asked anyone in that town whether Ray and Diane's boy would ever be cast out of his own home, they would have laughed at you. That is how solid the ground felt beneath my feet. That is how far I had to fall. There was one rule in our house that stood above every other rule, and my father repeated it so often that it became part of the furniture, part of the air we breathed. We handle our problems inside this family, he would say, and nobody outside ever needs to know our business. As a boy, I thought it was about pride. I thought it meant we didn't air our dirty laundry, that we didn't go running to neighbors with our troubles, and for most of my life, that is exactly what it meant. It was a good rule, an honorable rule, the kind of thing a proud man teaches his son. I had no idea, none at all, that those same words had been carved into my father decades before I was born, for a reason that had nothing to do with pride. I had no idea that rule was a wall he had built around a secret. There was one crack in the picture, one shadow at the edge of the family portrait, and for most of my childhood I never thought to question it. My father had a brother. His name was Frank. Uncle Frank existed in our family the way a missing tooth exists in a smile. As an absence you learn to stop noticing. When I was very young, there were a few photographs of the two of them together, young men with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning. And then, somewhere in my early childhood, Frank simply vanished from our lives. No funeral, no falling out that anyone would explain. When I asked about him, my father's face would close like a door, and my mother would gently change the subject. Frank and your dad had a disagreement a long time ago, she'd say. Some things don't heal. Leave it be. So I left it be. For 30 years, I left it be. I want you to hold on to Uncle Frank. Because that estrangement, that quiet gap in our family that everyone had agreed never to discuss, was not a small thing. It was the first loose thread in a story that had been sitting inside our house, undisturbed, for longer than I had been alive. But I didn't know that yet. Back then, Frank was just a name that made my father go quiet, and I had a life to build. I worked alongside my dad on those job sites through high school, through my 20s, learning the business the way he'd learned it, the way his father had learned it. The plan, the unspoken understanding between us, was that one day the company would be mine. It was never written down. It didn't need to be. In our family, some promises were simply understood, and I built my entire life around that understanding. By my early 30s, I was practically running the day-to-day of the company. I knew every client, every supplier, every corner of that business. My father was proud of me, in his own reserved way, the kind of man who showed love by trusting you with responsibility, rather than by saying the words out loud. I had a good life, a steady life. I had roots so deep I thought nothing on this earth could ever pull me up out of that soil. And that, I have learned, is exactly when life reaches for you. Not when you're struggling and bracing for a blow, but when you're comfortable, and settled, and certain, and looking the other way. Because it was right in the middle of that comfortable, settled certainty that I met a woman with a warm smile and a gift for making people feel like the most important person in the room. It was right then that I met Sabrina. I met Sabrina on an ordinary weekday afternoon, which is how these things always seem to happen, the ones that change everything. She had come into the office of the business to ask about a quote for some work on a property she managed. She was sharp, easy to talk to, quick with a joke, and she had this way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the world worth listening to. I have gone back over that first meeting 1,000 times in my mind since. I have tried to find the warning in it, the thing I should have seen. And the honest truth is that there was nothing. She was warm. She was kind. She was, by every measure I had, exactly the kind of person you would want to bring home to your parents. So that is exactly what I did. I brought her home, and my family fell in love with her faster than I did. The first Sunday dinner she came to, I was nervous the way any man is nervous bringing a woman to meet his family. I need not have worried. Within an hour, Sabrina and my mother were in the kitchen together like they had known each other for years, my mother showing her the old family recipes she rarely shared with anyone. My father, who normally sized up newcomers with the enthusiasm of a man inspecting a leaky roof, was laughing at something she'd said before the meal was even served. My sister Emily, I remember, was a little quieter than usual that night. I didn't think anything of it at the time. But Emily, it would turn out, was the only one at that table whose instincts were working properly. She was the only one who felt the faint wrong note underneath all that warmth. And she said nothing, because who was she to argue with a room full of people falling in love? Over the months that followed, Sabrina didn't just date me, she joined us. She became a fixture at Sunday dinner, then a fixture at the office, dropping by with coffee, remembering everyone's orders, asking my father about the business, with a curiosity that flattered him. She asked about how my grandfather had started the company, about the early years, about the lean times and the good times. She asked about our family history, the way a person asks when they truly care. And my father, a man who never talked about the past, opened up to her in ways he never had with me. I remember feeling grateful for it. I remember thinking she had unlocked something in him. It never once occurred to me that a person can ask about your history not because they love you, but because they are looking for something, a crack, a weakness, a door left unlocked. There was one evening, early on, that I did not think about again for years. I had come to my parents' house to pick Sabrina up. Everyone was in the living room, and I went looking for her, and I found her in my father's home office, the small room off the hallway where he kept his files, his records, the paperwork of a lifetime. She was standing by his old desk, and as I came in, she slid the bottom drawer shut with her hip, casual, smooth, and turned to me with that warm smile, saying she'd been looking for a pen. I believed her. Why on earth wouldn't I have believed her? She was the woman I loved, standing in my parents' house, looking for a pen. I have replayed the sound of that drawer sliding shut more times than I can count. At the time, it was nothing. It would turn out to be the beginning of everything. The years rolled on, and Sabrina wove herself deeper and deeper into the family. My mother started referring to her as the daughter she'd always dreamed of having, right in front of Emily, who would smile tightly and say nothing. On holidays, Sabrina had her own traditions with my parents now, her own inside jokes with my father, her own place in the rhythm of the household that had nothing to do with me. People say that when you love someone, you want them to be embraced by your family, and I did. But looking back, there was something almost unnatural in how completely she was absorbed, how quickly the boundary between girlfriend and blood seemed to dissolve. She wasn't just welcomed into my family, she was becoming the center of it. And I, the son, the one whose family it actually was slowly, without noticing, drifting toward the edge of my own life. I want to be fair to her, and to myself, and to the truth. For a long time, those years were genuinely happy. I am not telling you a story where the villain twirls a mustache from the very first scene. That is not how real life works, and it is not how real people are ruined. Sabrina was, for years, good to me and good to my family, or good enough that no one could have known the difference. That is what made all of it so effective. If she had been cold, or cruel, or obvious, we would have seen it coming from a mile away. But she was warm, she was generous with her time. She made my mother laugh and my father proud. She was the perfect daughter-in-law in every visible way. And the perfect disguise, I would learn, is not a mask that hides a monster. The perfect disguise is kindness, worn every single day, until no one can imagine you as anything else. But somewhere in the 5th year, the first hairline crack appeared, and it appeared where these things so often do. It appeared around money. My father, as I told you, was a man who counted every dollar twice and had never in his life lent money he didn't expect back to the penny. So I was surprised, one afternoon, when I overheard a conversation between him and Sabrina that I was not meant to hear. It was about a sum of money, a significant sum, and the strange thing, the thing that stuck in my chest like a splinter, was the tone of it. My father did not sound like a man doing a favor. He sounded like a man paying a debt. When I asked him about it later, gently, he brushed it off, told me it was between him and Sabrina and none of my concern. My father, telling me that his own finances were none of my concern. That had never happened before. I told myself it was nothing, a private arrangement. Maybe she was in a tight spot and too proud to let me know, so she'd gone to him instead. I built a dozen innocent explanations, and I believed every one of them, because the alternative, that something was wrong beneath the surface of my happy family, was unthinkable. But the splinter stayed, and over the following months, I noticed it again and again. Small sums, then larger ones. A man who lectured me about wasting money on a new work truck was quietly, steadily, handing over amounts that made no sense. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. That was not generosity, and it was not a loan. It was the first of many payments. I just did not yet know what my father was paying for, or who was really collecting. I have put off telling you how the relationship ended, and I've put it off on purpose, because I need you to understand something before I do. When I finally saw who Sabrina really was, it was not through some grand betrayal. It was through a series of small, sickening discoveries, the kind that make you feel like the floor is tilting under you, while everyone around you insists it's perfectly level. It started with little inconsistencies, stories that didn't line up, money of mine that went places I couldn't account for, explanations that were always just a little too smooth, delivered a little too quickly. For a long time, I did what people in my position always do. I chose to believe her, because believing her was easier than facing what disbelieving her would mean. But the discoveries kept coming, and eventually they reached a point I could not explain away. I learned that Sabrina had not been honest with me about our finances, that money I had believed we were building together had been quietly moving somewhere else. And I learned, in the same terrible stretch of days, that I had not been the only man in her life during our years together. I am not going to dwell on the details of that, because the details are not really the point of this story, and because even now, after everything, they are painful to say out loud. What matters is that the woman my entire family had embraced as one of our own had been living a double life, and I had been the last to know. The perfect daughter-in-law had a second face, and I had finally seen it. So I ended it. And here is where my father's rule, the rule that had shaped my whole life, quietly reached out and set the trap I would walk straight into. We handle our problems inside this family, and nobody outside ever needs to know. When I ended things with Sabrina, I did not go to my parents with the ugly truth. I did not sit my mother down and tell her that the daughter she adored had been unfaithful and dishonest. I did not hand my father the evidence. Some part of me wanted to protect them from it. Some part of me was ashamed, the way betrayed people are so often ashamed as if the betrayal were somehow their own failure. And some part of me simply believed I didn't need to explain myself. They were my parents. Their loyalty was a given. So I told them only that it hadn't worked out, and I left it at that. That silence was the single greatest mistake of my life, because Sabrina did not stay silent. While I was quietly protecting everyone's feelings, being the bigger man, handling it inside the family the way I'd been raised to, she was doing the exact opposite. She got to my parents first, and she got to them with her version. A version in which she was the wounded party, the loyal woman who had given 6 years of her life only to be cast aside by a man who had grown cold and difficult. I didn't know she was doing this. That's what makes it so effective and so cruel. She was rewriting the story of our relationship in real time, to the very people whose opinion mattered most to me, while I said nothing, because I thought saying nothing was the honorable thing to do. By the time I understood the game that was being played, the score was already lopsided, and I hadn't even known I was on the field. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came about a month after the breakup. I called my mother, the way I always did, and there was a coolness in her voice I had never heard directed at me in my entire life. She asked me, carefully, whether I had been fair to Sabrina. Fair to Sabrina. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, feeling the ground shift. I told her it was complicated, that there were things she didn't know, and my mother said something I will never forget. She said, "That poor girl is devastated, Ethan, and I hope you know what you did. I hope you know what you did." As if I were the guilty one. As if 6 years of my life, and the truth I was carrying alone to protect her, counted for nothing against a story she'd been told by someone else. I could have fixed it right then. I want you to understand that, because it is one of the great regrets of my life. If I had driven to my parents' house that very night and laid the whole ugly truth on their kitchen table, the affair, the money, all of it, this story might have ended differently, but I didn't. My pride wouldn't let me, and my father's rule wouldn't let me, and some stubborn, wounded part of me thought, they should just know. They're my parents. They shouldn't need me to prove that I'm the one telling the truth. They should choose me on faith. I was so certain they would come around. I was so certain that blood would win in the end. I gave them time and space and silence, and I trusted them to find their way back to their own son. And into that silence, that gap I left open out of pride, Sabrina poured everything she had. The first holiday after the breakup was Thanksgiving, and it was the first time in 38 years that I was not fully welcome at my parents' table. It didn't come as an outright banishment. That's not how these things happen. It came as a suggestion, delivered gently by my mother, that it might be easier for everyone, less tense, less awkward, if I sat this one out, just this once, to keep the peace. And when I asked, with a sinking feeling, whether Sabrina would be there was a long pause on the line, and then my mother said, "Well, she has nowhere else to go, Ethan. She's family. She's family." I hung up the phone and I sat alone in my house on Thanksgiving, and I thought about the empty chair at that table, the one that should have been mine, and the woman sitting in the seat beside it. That was the night the real weight of it landed on me. I told myself, again, that it was temporary. Emotions were high, people needed time. But the following months did not bring me back to the table. They pushed me further from it. The phone calls grew shorter and then rarer. I would call my mother and get voicemail, then a text hours later saying she was busy. She'd call tomorrow. Tomorrow rarely came. I found out about family gatherings after they'd already happened. From photographs, and in more than one of those photographs, there she was, Sabrina, standing where I should have been standing, in the family that was supposed to be mine, smiling that warm smile at a camera held by my own mother. My ex-girlfriend was living my life, attending my family's dinners, sleeping under the roof I grew up under, and I was on the outside looking in, unable to understand how any of it was possible. Then came the blow that told me this was no longer about hurt feelings. It was about the business. One afternoon, a supplier I'd worked with for a decade called me, confused, to ask why the new paperwork on an account had a different name on it. Sabrina's name. I thought it had to be a mistake. It was not a mistake. Somehow, in the months I'd been frozen out, Sabrina had been given a foothold inside the family company, the company my grandfather built, the company that was supposed to be my inheritance and my life's work. My father's explanation, when I finally cornered him about it, was thin and strange. "She's good with the books," he said, not meeting my eyes. "She's helping us out. She's helping us out." The woman who had betrayed me was now inside the walls of the one thing my family had built across 3 generations, and my father could not look at me while he told me why. That was the moment the fear crept in, though I couldn't have named it yet, because this was no longer the behavior of parents who were simply upset with their son or fond of his ex, handing a former girlfriend a role in the family business, giving her access to the accounts, the records, the finances. That is not something you do out of sympathy. That is something you do when you have no other choice. But I couldn't see that yet. All I could see was betrayal, and all I could feel was a rage and a grief so tangled together I couldn't tell them apart. My own father had chosen to trust a liar with our family's legacy over his own son. I lay awake night after night, asking myself the same question. What could possibly make a man do that? What did she have on him? Then the whispers started, and the whispers were the cruelest part. I began to notice that relatives who had known me my whole life were treating me differently. A cousin who didn't return my calls. An aunt who was suddenly cold at a family funeral. The one gathering I couldn't be excluded from. And little by little I pieced together that a story was circulating about me. A story I did not recognize, in which I was the villain. In this story I had done something to Sabrina. Something worse than a breakup. Something that justified everything. I never got the full shape of it, only the shrapnel of it. The sidelong looks and the dropped conversations. Someone had been telling people that I was not the man they thought I was, and there was only one person with the motive and the access to plant that story in the soil of my own family. I was not just being pushed out, I was being buried. My sister Emily was the only one who never turned. Through all of it, she stayed in contact with me, quietly, sometimes secretly, because taking my side openly came at a cost inside that house. And it was Emily who finally said the words that changed the direction of my life. We were sitting in her car outside a coffee shop, and she was pale, and she told me she needed me to hear something and not overreact. She said, "Ethan, you need to understand what's happening over there. It's not just that they're mad at you. Something is wrong with Mom and Dad. They're scared of her. I've watched it. When Sabrina's in the room, Dad flinches. Mom watches her like she's watching a lit fuse. This isn't love, Ethan. Whatever this is, they're terrified." And then she told me the thing that finally broke the dam. She told me about the will. Emily had seen paperwork she wasn't supposed to see. Documents on my father's desk. And what she'd read had frightened her enough to risk everything to tell me. My parents had made changes. Sabrina had been written into the family's future, into the estate, into the ownership of the business. And I, their only son, had been quietly moved to the margins of it. The child was being replaced by the stranger, in ink, on paper, with lawyers. I remember the sound of my own blood in my ears when Emily said it. I remember thinking there had been a mistake, that this could not be real, that no set of circumstances on earth could make my parents do this to me. And that is the exact moment my grief turned into something else, something colder and more useful. That is the moment I stopped asking, why are they doing this to me, and started asking a far more dangerous question. What does she have on them? Because Emily was right. I had been so consumed by my own pain that I had misread the entire situation. I had seen my parents as people who had betrayed me, and only as that. But betrayers don't flinch. Betrayers don't watch a person like they're watching a lit fuse. My parents weren't acting like people who had fallen out of love with their son. They were acting like people with a gun to their heads, doing whatever they were told, paying whatever they were asked, because the alternative was something they could not survive. Every cruelty I had suffered, the exclusions, the money, the business, the will, I had read it as rejection. What if it was ransom? What if my parents were not choosing Sabrina at all, but obeying her? And if that was true, then the only question that mattered was the one that would consume the next year of my life. What did she find? What did she know? What was worth all of this? From that day, I stopped being a heartbroken son and started being something closer to an investigator into my own family. I began writing everything down. Dates, amounts, conversations, every strange thing I could remember, and every new thing I could learn. I built, on the wall of my spare room, a timeline of the last 2 years, and then a timeline that stretched back much further, because some instinct told me that whatever this was, it had not started with the breakup. I want to tell you about the false trails first, because I chased every one of them, and each dead end taught me something I needed to know. The first theory was the obvious one, the one you're probably thinking right now. Sabrina was simply after money, a gold digger who had found a soft, wealthy family and sunk her hooks into the parents when the son cut her off. But the numbers wouldn't cooperate with that theory. When Emily quietly helped me piece together what she could of my parents' finances, The money wasn't just flowing one direction into Sabrina's pocket, the way it would with a simple grifter. The pattern was stranger, older, and colder than that. My father had been moving money in unusual ways for far longer than Sabrina had been in our lives. Years longer. There were withdrawals, regular ones, going back well over a decade. Cash pulled out on roughly the same week every single year, long before any of us had ever heard Sabrina's name. A gold digger explains the last 2 years. A gold digger does not explain 15 years of my careful, frugal father quietly pulling cash out of his accounts on the same week every year, and telling no one, and showing it nowhere. That annual withdrawal was a thread, and when I pulled on it, the whole story began to come apart. The second theory was Emily's, and it was uglier. She wondered whether our father had had an affair, years ago, and whether Sabrina had somehow discovered it and was using it to control him. It fit the fear. It fit the secrecy. So we chased it. And while we found no evidence of any affair, the chase led us somewhere far worse. Because in trying to trace those annual withdrawals, we found the date. Every year, the money came out in the same week, and when I laid a calendar beside the newspaper archive of our town from decades back, I found what that week had been marking all along. It corresponded to a night, a specific night, more than 30 years ago, before I was even born. And on that night, according to the yellowed local paper, a young man had been killed on a rain-slicked road at the edge of town, struck by a car that never stopped, by a driver who was never found. His name was Danny Kessler. He was 19 years old. He had been walking home along the shoulder of the road on a dark, wet night, and a car had come around the bend too fast, and it had struck him and killed him, and it had driven away into the dark and never looked back. The paper called it a hit and run. The police never solved it. There were no witnesses, no leads, nothing but a grieving mother named Ruth Kessler, who buried her only son and spent the rest of her life not knowing who had taken him from her. I read that story sitting alone at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, and I felt something cold settle over me, because I did not yet understand what it meant, but I understood that it meant something. My father's secret annual withdrawal fell on the anniversary of a stranger's death, and I did not want to know why. There was one more thread I had been avoiding, because it meant reaching into the oldest, most forbidden corner of our family. Uncle Frank, my father's brother, erased from our lives before I was old enough to ask why. If any living person understood the shape of my father's secret, it would be the brother who had vanished at the exact fault line where the secret must have formed. It took me weeks to find him. He was living quietly a few hours away, an old man now, alone. When I finally sat across from him and told him who I was and why I'd come, he went very still, and for a long moment I thought he would ask me to leave. Instead, he looked at me with the saddest eyes I have ever seen on a human face, and he said, "So she found it. After all these years, somebody finally found it." And I knew, in that instant, that everything was about to change. Frank didn't want to tell me. He had spent more than 30 years running from this, and I was asking him to turn around and face it. But something in him, some old and buried decency, wouldn't let him send me away in the dark. He told me only this, at first. He said, "I can't be the one to tell you the whole of it. It's not mine to tell. But you go, and you ask your father where he was the night that boy died on Miller's Bend. You ask him that, and you watch his face, and then you'll understand why I couldn't stay in that family, and why I've slept badly every night for 30 years. Miller's Bend, the rain-slicked road at the edge of town. Danny Kessler, my father. My whole life reorganized itself around those words in the space of a single breath, and I drove home not knowing if I wanted the answer I already knew was coming. I did not go to my father. Not yet. I couldn't. Instead, I went back to the one place I knew the truth might be hiding in plain sight, the place my mind had been circling for weeks without my understanding why. My father's home office, the small room off the hallway, and the bottom drawer of his old desk, the drawer I had seen Sabrina quietly slide shut with her hip years ago, when she told me she was only looking for a pen. My parents were out. Emily kept watch, and I opened that drawer with my hands shaking, and I dug down beneath the ordinary files, the tax records and the insurance papers, until my fingers found an old envelope, soft with age, pushed all the way to the back. Inside it were newspaper clippings about the death of Danny Kessler, and beneath the clippings, records of payments, made anonymously, every single year, to a woman named Ruth Kessler. I sat on the floor of that office, and I understood, finally, what I was holding. My father had been driving that night, My father had struck and killed a 19-year-old boy on a dark and rainy road, and instead of stopping, instead of facing it, he had driven home and buried it, and lived with it, and let it carve that rule into his soul. We handle our problems inside this family, and nobody outside ever needs to know. For over 30 years he had carried it in silence, and in his own broken way he had tried to atone, sending money in secret to the mother of the boy he had killed, on the anniversary of the worst thing he ever did. And Sabrina, all those years ago, standing in this room, looking for a pen, had found this drawer. She had found the one thing on earth that could destroy my father, and she had been holding it over all of us ever since. Now, at last, the whole shape of it stood in front of me, and it was worse than any theory I had chased. Every single thing that had broken my heart across those 2 years had a new and terrible explanation. The money my father handed her was not a loan and not a gift. It was the price of her silence. The foothold in the business, the access to the accounts, was not because she was good with the books. It was so she could take what she wanted, whenever she wanted it, with my father powerless to refuse. And the will, the paperwork that wrote me out and wrote her in, was not my parents choosing her over me. It was my parents doing the only thing that kept her from picking up a phone and ending my father's life as he knew it, sending a proud old man to prison and destroying our family name in the town where it had meant something for 3 generations. And the smear campaign, the whispers, the story that turned my own relatives against me. I finally understood that too. It was insurance. Sabrina was not a reckless person. She knew that the one real danger to her, the one person likely to start digging, to notice the money and the strangeness and the fear, was me, the devoted son. So she had made sure that if I ever started asking questions, no one would listen. She poisoned the well before I ever got thirsty. She turned me into the family villain so that when I finally started shouting the truth, it would sound like nothing more than the bitterness of a jilted, difficult man who couldn't accept that he'd been left behind. She didn't just take my place at the table. She made certain that no one would believe me when I said the table had been stolen. I want to be honest with you about what she was, because I spent a long time trying to find a softer word for it, and there isn't one. Sabrina was not a heartbroken woman who got lucky with a guilty family. Sabrina was a person who, years earlier, had gone looking through a man's private drawers while a household laughed in the next room, and who had found a family's deepest wound, and who had spent 6 years pretending to love us all while she decided exactly how to use it. The dinners, the recipes, the curiosity about our history, the warmth, all of it I now saw had a purpose underneath. She hadn't wormed her way into my family in spite of the secret. She had done it because of the secret. We were never her family. We were her investment. And she had been patient enough to wait years for it to pay. I confronted her. I know that was reckless, and I know that a smarter man might have gone straight to a lawyer, but you have to understand the state I was in, the grief and the rage of 2 years pouring out at once. I went to her, and I told her that I knew about Danny Kessler, about the drawer, about the payments, about all of it, and in that moment, the mask I had watched her wear for years finally came off. And what was underneath it was the coldest thing I have ever seen. She did not panic. She did not deny it. She simply looked at me, calm as still water, and she said, "Then you know exactly how this works, don't you? You know what happens to your father if I make one phone call. You know what happens to your mother. So you're going to go home, Ethan, and you're going to be quiet, like a good son. Because I have nothing left to lose, and your family has everything." And she smiled at me. She smiled. I drove home that night with her words ringing in my ears, and for the first time I understood the full cruelty of the trap my parents had been living in. It was not that they had stopped loving me. It was that every act of love toward me had become a weapon she could use against them. If they defended me, she would destroy my father. If they welcomed me back to the table, she would take it as a threat and tighten her grip. My parents had been forced to choose, every single day, between their son and their survival, and they had been doing it silently, unable to explain, watching me grow to hate them because the truth was the one thing they could never hand me. I had spent 2 years believing they had chosen her over me. I was about to learn how completely I had misjudged what that choice really was. I never got the chance to tell my father that I knew. 3 days after I confronted Sabrina, before I could figure out my next move, my mother called me, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand her. My father had collapsed. The years of pressure, the secret, the fear, the impossible weight of it all, had finally stopped his heart. Ray, the man who built the table with his own hands, The man who carried a dead boy's memory for 30 years was gone. And the last real conversation he and I ever had, months before, had been a cold and distant one. Two men on opposite sides of a wall, neither of us fully understood. I did not get to tell him that I finally knew the truth. I did not get to tell him I understood. That is a grief I will carry for the rest of my life. But my father, it turned out, had known this day might come, and he had left something behind. About a week after the funeral, my mother, hollowed out and finally free to speak, handed me a sealed envelope. My father had written it some time before, and had left instructions that if anything ever happened to him, it was to go to me, and to me alone. My name was on the front in his careful, blocky handwriting, the same handwriting from the payment records in the drawer. I sat in my car in the funeral home parking lot, and I opened it, and I read the last words my father would ever say to me. And everything I thought I understood about being pushed out of my own family broke apart and rearranged itself one final time. In that letter, my father told me the truth about Danny Kessler, in his own words, the confession he had never been able to make out loud. And then he told me the thing that Sabrina had never wanted me to know, the final turn of the knife she'd been twisting all along. Because it was not only my father's freedom she had been holding over them. Somewhere in those 2 years, she had made a second threat, a worse one. She had told my parents that if they did not comply, if they did not keep paying, keep giving, keep me at arm's length, she would not only expose my father, she would make sure the blame fell on me. She had positioned herself, through the business accounts and the paperwork she now controlled, to construct a version of events in which their son was tangled up in the money, the cover-up, the crime. She had threatened to take me down with him, and so my father made the only choice a father like him could make. He decided that if he had to lose one thing, it would not be his son's freedom, and it would not be his son's future. It would be his son's love. He pushed me away on purpose. He let me believe he had chosen Sabrina over me, because the alternative, keeping me close, was the very thing she had promised to punish. Every cold phone call, every skipped holiday, every cruelty that had broken my heart, he had allowed, and even orchestrated, to put distance between me and the woman who had promised to destroy me if I got too close to the truth. In his letter he wrote a single line that I have read 1,000 times since. He wrote, "I would rather you hate me and be safe than love me and be ruined." I lost my father twice, once to a lie and once to the truth of how much he had loved me all along. So here is where I was left, standing in the wreckage of everything I thought I knew. In my hands I held the proof of a 30-year-old crime. I held the power to clear my own name forever, to free my mother from the grip of a woman who had bled our family dry, and to finally give a mother named Ruth Kessler the one thing she had been denied for 3 decades, the truth about who had taken her son. But that same proof would destroy my father's name, the name he had spent his whole life protecting, the name on the business, the name on the table, the name I carried. To free the living, I would have to expose the dead. And there is no version of that choice that doesn't cost you something you can never get back. I made my decision, and I'll tell you what it was. Though I've come to believe there was never a clean answer, only a choice about who deserved the truth more. I thought about Ruth Kessler, an old woman by now, who had spent 30 years lighting a candle for a son whose killer was never named. I thought about my father, and I understood at last that his whole broken life had been an attempt to hold that truth back, and that his silence had never once brought him peace. And I decided that the secret had already destroyed enough. It had cost Danny Kessler his life, and Ruth her son, and my father his soul, and my family 2 years and a father. I would not let it keep taking. I brought what I had found into the light, all of it, and I let the truth do what my father never could. Sabrina's hold, built entirely on a secret, turned to nothing the moment the secret was gone. With her leverage destroyed, Sabrina lost everything she had spent 6 years building. The threats that had ruled our family for 2 years were suddenly empty, because you cannot blackmail a family with a secret the whole world already knows. She was removed from the business, removed from the will, removed from our lives, and the version of me she had planted in everyone's mind fell apart the moment the real story came out. My mother and I are slowly, carefully, finding our way back to each other, 2 people who were both used as weapons against the man we loved. Emily, who never once stopped believing me, is the reason I survived any of it, and Ruth Kessler finally knows what happened to her boy. It is not a happy ending. It is something quieter and harder than that. It is the truth, standing where a lie used to stand. I've told you this story because I spent 2 years believing the cruelest thing a person can believe, that my own parents had looked at me and chosen a stranger over their own blood. And it wasn't true. It was never true. They didn't choose Sabrina over me. They gave me up to protect me, and they died letting me hate them because they loved me too much to explain. If there is one thing I need you to take from all of this, it is this. Sometimes the people who seem to be pushing you away are the ones carrying the heaviest weight to keep you safe. And sometimes the monster in the family portrait isn't the one who left. It's the one everyone welcomed in with open arms. Be careful who you let sit at your table. Not everyone who smiles at your family loves them. So let me leave you with the questions I've had to live with, and I truly want to know what you think, because I still don't know if I got it right. If you had been holding what I was holding, would you have brought the truth to light, knowing it would destroy your own father's name forever? Or would you have buried it, to protect the memory of a man who spent his whole life trying to make up for one terrible night? Would you have seen through Sabrina, or would you have welcomed her in, the way we all did? Tell me in the comments, because these are the questions that still keep me awake. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Because the next story I have to tell you is, in some ways, even harder to believe than this one.